Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction and reception. And I think it's fair to say now that as we're getting near the end of our time here at the Western Conservative Summit, that we can now safely congratulate Jeff Hunt, Don Sweeting, and the staffs of the Centennial Institute and Colorado Christian University for another outstanding Western Conservative Summit. It's really been a great weekend. And you know, I think it's only fitting that as we prepare to leave, that we turn our attention to what we were actually going to do when we walk out those doors. That's why on this Sunday morning, I want to bring you a message of encouragement that I hope will motivate you to action. Because even though there's much broken in this world, that brokenness is not the world's primary characteristic. Even in the midst of that brokenness, can we agree that God is still sovereign? That there is nothing that happens in the entire domain of creation that causes God to say, wow, I sure didn't expect that. So friends, I want to make sure you hear this today. The story God is writing, the arc of history is still unfolding. It's not over. And I've read the last chapter of the book, and guess what? God wins. Now, that's not to say that between now and then, we won't have battles to fight and problems to solve. But we should be happy warriors in this process. We have the joy of participating in God's work in the world. So I'd like to take the few minutes that I have today to identify three things that I think we can and should do as we prepare to leave the Western Conservative Summit. The first one is this. We need to be known by what we are for and not merely what we stand against. In the first chapter of the book, Restoring All Things, which John Stonestreet, the president of the Colson Center, and I wrote together, we observe that the Bible is full of re-words, words that begin with R-E, words like reconcile, redeem, and restore. But too often, we Christians focus on other re-words, words like resist, rebuke, restrain, and reject. Now, there's no doubt that in a world moving in the wrong direction, resisting and restraining are sometimes the proper posture for those of us who want to promote the good, the true, and the beautiful. But while we hold up one hand of restraint, we should also be holding out another hand of restoration and reconciliation. Because in the world of ideas, you cannot fight bad ideas with no ideas. You cannot fight something with nothing. And you know, I believe we have an example in the pro-life movement. We just heard from Kristen Hawkins. Wasn't that a great presentation that she made, by the way? You know, we heard from her that pro-lifers are opposed to abortion, sure. But that movement really caught fire when it started opening pregnancy care centers across the country. Despite what those on the radical left would have you believe, most Americans know that the pro-life movement really cares for women and children because they've seen members of this army of compassion with their own eyes in their own towns. One of the results of this compassionate activism is that America is now more pro-life than at any time in the past quarter century. And we're seeing the number of abortions fall year after year. But what would it look like if Christians behaved this strategically in other areas of life? If we viewed every domain of life, from the arts and entertainment to the law, from education to entrepreneurship to, well, again, every area of life as belonging to Christ. And we sought to restore the brokenness in those areas as well. Michelangelo said, I criticize by creating something beautiful. Wouldn't it be great if that could be said of Christians in every area of life? So let's be known not just by what we stand against, but by what we stand for. The second action item that I hope we take away from the Western Conservative Summit is that we need to tell the stories that we have heard here with our families, friends, and neighbors and churches. And more generally, we need to recover what has become, at least in the conservative movement, the lost art of storytelling. My friend, the novelist and musician Andrew Peterson, said that if you want someone to hear the truth, you should tell them the truth. But if you want someone to love the truth, you should tell them a story. The philosopher Damon of Athens, who was also a musicologist, said this: "Give me the songs of a people, and I care not who writes its laws." You know, the power of storytelling shouldn't be a surprise to Christians because Jesus himself was a storyteller. Mark 4:34 says that Jesus did not speak to them except in parables, except in stories. Chuck Colson, one of my mentors and the namesake of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, where I now serve as vice president, was fond of saying politics is downstream from culture. And storytelling is one of the key ways that we make and shape culture. Friends, if facts, data, history, logic, and reason would win the cultural arguments, we would have already won. I thank God that we have all of these on our side. But if we want to win hearts and minds, if we want to move the needle in our direction in important cultural conversations, facts, data, history, logic, and reason, while absolutely necessary, rarely appeal to the heart. Those of us in the conservative movement must recover the art of storytelling. We must take our places not just in the churches, but as John Sullivan said yesterday, in the Cineplex as well, and in the art galleries, and on the bestseller list, and on the record charts. Now, if you're gifted in the art of storytelling, especially this is directed to some of you young people from Colorado Christian University and other young people that I've been privileged to meet this weekend, I'd like to encourage you to consider what God might be calling you to a career in the arts or in media or entertainment. And those of you who are perhaps not so gifted in that area, well, keep in mind that we are all consumers and supporters of media and cultural stories by the way we spend our money, by the way we spend our time. Think and pray carefully about where you're investing your time and money, and make sure that you're supporting the work of those who are trying to promote the good, the true, and the beautiful. So first, we must remember what we stand for and not just what we stand against. We must recover the art of storytelling. And the third and final point that I hope you take away from the Western Conservative Summit this morning is this: that we must care for and serve the victims of bad ideas. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a book that impacted me and many of us in the conservative movement is Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences. Even many of you who have not read that book can understand a key idea just from the title. Ideas do have consequences. Ideas matter. One of the consequences of a bad idea is that it produces victims. Marxism was a bad idea cooked up in the academy in the mid-19th century. It became an ideology that cost the lives of more than 100 million people in the 20th century. The bad ideas of the sexual revolution of the early and mid-20th century have left more than 50 million dead from abortion and sexually transmitted diseases. And as the terrible but true saying goes, every abortion produces one dead, but also one wounded. But we must not merely criticize and condemn the sexual revolution, though it is important that we tell the truth about it. We have to care for its victims, too. Throughout history, when bad ideas ravaged other eras, Christians triumphed not merely by condemning or running away from the darkness, but often by running toward the misery of others, by becoming a light in that darkness, as Ken Blackwell mentioned so beautifully and eloquently earlier this morning. The sociologist and historian Rodney Stark recounts one such story in his book, The Rise of Christianity. Between 250 and 270 AD, a terrible plague called the Plague of Cyprian devastated the Roman Empire. 5,000 people succumbed in Rome alone. Those who could fled the plague, but Christians often did not. They ran toward the plague, caring for the victims of the plague, including their pagan neighbors. Many Christians, leaders, paid for their loving service with their very lives, as they too succumbed to that plague of Cyprian. But that was not the end of the story. Rodney Stark says that Christianity, which up until then had been a fringe religion, became the dominant religion of the Roman world in just a generation or two, in part because of the powerful witness of those Christians who ran toward the plague. And we don't have to go back 18 centuries to see a similar example. Late last year, I visited Liberia with the Christian Ministry Samaritan's Purse. I met Dr. Kent Brantley and aid worker Nancy Wright-Bowl, who both contracted the terrible Ebola virus because they didn't run away from the plague. They ran towards the plague. Many of you know that story because it was a story of sacrificial love that even the mainstream media couldn't ignore. And it allowed Kent and Nancy to share the gospel literally to hundreds of millions of people around the world. I want to close with one final story. And again, this is a story that John Stonestreet and I tell in Restoring All Things. It's the story of Ephesus, a city in the first century that was dominated by the temple of Artemis, one of the Greek gods. The priest of the temple maintained a perpetual fire there in worship of Artemis. Now, fire, of course, was a basic necessity of life in that era because it allowed for cooking, for cleaning, and for warmth. If the fire went out in a home, the residents were in big trouble. And the only solution in Ephesus was to go to the temple with a ceramic bowl in order to get hot coals from the temple fire. The priest would require a payment to appease the pagan gods and also to maintain the temple. To get fire from another source, the priest taught, was both an affront to the gods and risked their wrath. Christians, however, in Ephesus were different. When they noticed a home without fire, they would bring hot coals to that family from their own fires in their own fire bowls. This simple act of love of neighbor made a powerful statement. First, it provided life-saving fire to a person who may have been too poor to pay a tribute to the temple. Secondly, it deprived the pagan temple of an important means of financial support. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, it proclaimed to the world that the Christians in Ephesus were not afraid of the pagan gods. To go back to the rewords that I introduced at the beginning of my talk, these Christians didn't merely resist, they restored. They undertook these acts of kindness toward their neighbors at great risk because they were acting against the prevailing power structure. But in the end, their relentless kindness carried the day and sped the demise of the temple system and led to the rise of Christianity. So I would like to close with this question. What does it mean to be a fire bearer in our day? What does it mean to be not merely nice by saying and doing what the world wants us Christians to say and do, but being truly kind in the biblical sense by giving people what they desperately need? I think answering that question is the challenge we face today as we leave the Western Conservative Summit. Friends, there's no doubt that we live in a broken world, but again, God is sovereign, Christ is Lord, and He's given us the privilege of being His hands and feet in this broken world. My mentor, Chuck Colson, the namesake again of the Colson Center, where I'm privileged to serve, was fond of saying, salvation does not ride in on Air Force One. Cal Thomas reminded us yesterday that for those of us who are Christians, our hope is not based on politics or ideology. Rather, in the words of the old hymn, our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. And if we can go today from the Western Conservative Summit with our imaginations rekindled to these important truths, I believe our time here will not have been in vain. And we might have the great joy of helping to bring about a powerful transformation in culture, perhaps even in our own lifetimes. God bless you, and thank you for letting me share with you today. God bless Colorado Christian University, the Centennial Institute, and those of you here at the Western Conservative Summit. Thank you.